Good evening. Thank you for joining the Maryland Center for History and Culture for this virtual program. My name is Chloe Green. I serve as the Public Programs and Outreach Manager here at MCHC, and I am your Zoom host for this evening's program. So I'll be behind the scenes running everything. And for this evening's program, we welcome you to Remembering Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a Baltimore celebration 1825 to 2025. So I will now begin the program by introducing our panelists for the evening and our moderator as well. So we're honored to welcome such an accomplished and knowledgeable group of professionals to this program. For the sake of time, we'll just be giving condensed versions of the biographies, but please know that we are only scratching the surface of all the great work that these panelists have done. So to begin, please give a warm welcome to our moderator, David Armenti, who serves as our Vice President of Education and Engagement here at MCHC. Welcome, David. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you, Chloe.
Of course. And I'm going to pass this program to you to introduce our panelists. But thank you all, and please enjoy this presentation.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Again, my name is David Armenti. Really excited to be here this evening with three wonderful scholars and community advocates here. But I will take a moment to mention that Dr. Lawrence Jackson will not be able to join us live for this evening's program, but in his absence, he has kindly put together a 30-minute video that we will share to begin the program with really a wonderful overview of research related to Miss Harper's life. So I will read Dr. Jackson's bio to get us started. He's an award-winning author and currently serves as the Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins University. Dr. Jackson is the founder and director of the Billie Holiday Center for Liberation Arts, which was founded in 2017. That project fosters organic links between the intellectual life of Johns Hopkins University and the city's historic African American communities, celebrating the strengths and potential of both. The BHCLA serves a cultural purpose, hosting regular events to nurture such connections, as well as an archival one, protecting artifacts of African American culture and politics. So we thank him for his contribution. Also would like to introduce one of our panelists, Dr. Ida E. Jones, who serves as the Associate Director of Special Collections and University Archivist at Morgan State University. She's a noted professional archivist and historian, award-winning author, educator, and recognized leader in the field of African American women's history. Dr. Jones is also a consummate scholar who believes deeply in the words of Mrs. Mary McLeod Bethune, who stated, "Power must walk hand in hand with humility, and the intellect must have a soul." Indeed. Lastly, we are joined by Miss Betty Bland Thomas. She is the former president of the Sharp-Leadenhall Planning Committee and current president of the South Baltimore Partnership, two organizations dedicated to the improvement of Sharp-Leadenhall in a number of areas, including community greening, inclusive housing, and youth works programs. Betty continues a rich tradition of feminist activism in the community of Sharp-Leadenhall, offering leadership, walking tours, and more. And she'll be able to make some of those connections with Mrs. Harper and how that historical context still informs the work and the commemorations that we do today. So again, very privileged to be in the presence of all of these folks, but we are going to hear first from Dr. Jackson. So I'm going to step down and let that part start. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good morning. My name is Lawrence Jackson. I'm a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of English and History at Johns Hopkins, and I just wanted to share a brief presentation with you today about the life of Frances Ellen Watkins Harper here in Baltimore. Sorry I couldn't be with you here and there in person. So if we begin today, we're just sort of thinking about this remarkable Baltimorean, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, whose life is somewhat well known, but perhaps she could be even better known. And Frances Ellen Watkins, as she was known until she married Fenton Harper in 1860, lived in Baltimore really between her birth in 1825 and around 1850 when she left. However, she became widely known to the world, sort of after she became a well-known speaker on the anti-slavery circuit, and then also one of the foremost Black women in the cause of women's rights in the United States, a bona fide suffragette. And of course, her work continued even after the Civil War and Emancipation. But she really is known to us today as the most important writer, African American writer of the 19th century. And maybe we should say also, sort of the long 19th century. I mean, she worked as a writer, publishing a short story, publishing multiple books of poetry, and then also working, quite well in a novel, for a period of really some 50 years. So, I mean, her work was really quite extraordinary. And she said, I think poetry is one of the great agents of culture, civilization, and refinement. I would teach men and women to love noble deeds by setting them to music of fitly spoken words. So, she was also, sort of known for a series of aphorisms and quite adamant about the cause of Black rights. Um, we don't know so much about her life here in Baltimore. She did not leave any autobiographical writings. I mean, all we really have are these sort of small tidbits that come to us from William Grant Still's The Underground Railroad. And of course, Harper was a conductor, or, I mean, again, I go back and forth between referring to her as Frances Harper or Frances Ellen Watkins. But some of the things that she said are really quite fascinating. Have I yearned for a mother's love? The grave was my robber. Before 3 years had scattered their blight around my path, death had won my mother from me. Would the strong arm of a brother have been welcome? I was my mother's only child, right? And then Still said that, she had contended with 1,000 disadvantages and had many trials to endure, which fain she would forget. And some people have speculated that, since she really never mentions a father in, sort of the 3 years that she's with a parent alive in the city, that she may have been the product of, a relationship between a white man and her mother. And it's also not really known, like, if her mother, who her mother's siblings were, because she winds up spending most of her early life here in Baltimore in the household of William Watkins, and I'll be saying a little bit more about him shortly. Now, of course, to be in Baltimore at all, we always want to remember what Frederick Douglass said was that to live in Baltimore City, really enslaved or free, was pretty much the peak of Black existence during the era of chattel slavery. And that for Douglass, who was enslaved, he was constantly trying to get to Baltimore. One of the reasons why so many African Americans were keen to live in Baltimore had something to do with the fact that the city had the largest percentage of freed people of any, from time to time, really, of any American city, and was probably the quality of life that was available, and especially this idea about mobility and being able to choose where you worked, made Baltimore in some ways more similar to Philadelphia, or places further north than it did to places that were further south. The population of African Americans in Baltimore in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, was substantial. Most of the people, in these era that you can see the population figures for, most of the Black people were freed. 75% of Black people were freed. So it was uncommon, really, to have the experience of being in bondage in the city. But even people who were enslaved in the city, again, like Douglass and others, found that there were unusual freedoms in the life of being an urban slave. And I've included some of the images, sort of for the customary work of oystering, and then also work huckstering in the markets. and the kinds of carding and black men were known for brick making, and then others like Douglas, worked as caulkers in the shipyards. But Baltimore was a very consequential place for the lives of early national African Americans and the establishment of African American culture. We can look at where Frances Watkins was living and the kinds of institutions that she frequented. And it sort of starts really around the 144 Camden Street, where she lived in the Watkins household, and also the Sharp Street Methodist Church that she almost certainly belonged to. Her uncle was an important figure at Sharp Street among the African American Methodists. He was a class leader. He was at least an occasional minister. He gave addresses at Sharp Street and then also at the Strawberry Alley Methodist Church. Sort of if we just sort of follow her from like Camden Street, going up above Pratt Street on Sharp Street, and then we also have two other churches that I believe were fairly significant in her life. One was the St. James Episcopal Church at North and Saratoga Street. The minister there, William Levington, had an important school in the 1820s and the 1830s. And the school was continued after his death in the 1838 or so. And then also sort of like in the next block was the Bethel AME Church, of course, which was the founding or part of the founding of the African Methodist Episcopal denomination. Um, Frances Watkins left her household on Camden Street with her biological relatives and worked in service at the household of a man named Robert Armstrong and his wife. Her name was Anansa. And they lived at 9 Utah Street, just sort of over here. And then we also have what is, really, I think, quite tantalizing, the Armstrong bookstore. Robert Armstrong was a bookseller, a fairly prominent bookseller, and the bookstore was there on Baltimore Street. And then the last part of this arc, if you just sort of look at this triangle over here at Pratt Street, and I just sort of have given it a place at Pratt in Utah, but it is meant to recover a number of different addresses. These are the pens run first by Austin Woolfolk, and then a little bit further down the street you would have a man named Hope Slater, and then later a man named Joseph Donovan, who would be the slave dealers of Baltimore. And so you have this traffic, we think about 12,500 people who are going to wind up being sold from Maryland into the Deep South. And so this was a constant reminder for African Americans in Baltimore about the violence and brutality of slavery, and something that was going to be quite important for the Watkins family and for Frances. There were some really significant figures in Baltimore during her era, and these people are actually, sort of leaving the city, either just as she's born or shortly after she's born. But these figures like Daniel Coker and Elisha Tyson were absolutely consequential figures in the abolitionist movement and also in the creation of independent Black churches. And, both of them, very powerfully connected to the Sharp Street Methodist Church, which would be, like the second or third oldest African American church in the United States. And then Coker, who will be one of the founders of Bethel and the AME faith, he's supposed to have been also like the first elected bishop of the AME faith. We'll find an African school and will be a really prominent educator here in Baltimore in the first decade of the 19th century, and then also will be an abolitionist pamphleteer, sort of devoting so much of his life to the anti-slavery cause. He will go on to be one of the Black people who is important in proponent of the American Colonization Society, and will actually leave the United States and repatriate himself to West Africa, to modern day Sierra Leone, in 1820. And of course, Tyson is also, like a philanthropist supporting the school, and was beloved by Black people in the city. Is, supposed to be 10,000 people who attended his funeral. Um, it's always important with what information and evidence that we have, and of course, it tends to be so inadequate for our purposes of reconstructing the lives of people of African descent under bondage. But we just want to also bear in mind that among people who are enslaved in the city, there are definitely ranges of experience. Again, the most complete account that we have of anyone, really anyone in the United States, but certainly anyone here in Maryland, right, is from Frederick Douglass. And, he would describe in some ways, some of the advantages that he had in the household of Sophia and Hugh Auld on Philpott Street, but in the same household, or rather across the street, he would notice young people who were absolutely destitute and also being actively brutalized. So, we just sort of think about Mrs. Atavis, and there's who was in the section of the city where Frances Ellen Watkins is moving around. And then also the photograph on the left is a gentleman that was living in Canton, and who is thought to have been around the time this photograph is taken, like almost 100 years old, or certainly well after his 80s. But the faces of bondage and enslaved African Americans. And these experiences and early images, but especially with enslavement and the use of the port and the steamboats to ship people to New Orleans, was really, really something that affected the consciousness of young Frances Ellen Watkins. And she said that after learning about a man who was actually what had happened, it's sort of like the passage of the different kind of a retrenchment by the Maryland State Legislature, where they're requiring, especially after the 1831 Nat Turner Rebellion in Southampton, Virginia, where they're requiring people who are visiting the state or people who have been manumitted to either go through a complex registration process and to receive sort of official permission to reside even briefly. And then if they overstay that brief permission, then they could actively be sold back into bondage. And she learned about a man who, had that experience and was sold to Georgia and died. And she wrote that, or she's reported to have said, upon that grave, I pledged myself to the anti-slavery cause. And so now I'll return to the person who was her uncle, William Watkins, who the gentleman at the top of the frame here. And Watkins was important in several distinct areas, obviously with overlap, but as a religious figure, as an educational figure, and then as a writer and lecturer and as an abolitionist. But he was the person, from the time he was like 19 years old, or maybe even 18 or 19 years old. He ran the Watkins Academy for Negro Youth, and this was on Camden Street. And really the nexus of like Camden Street and Howard Street and between Camden and Montgomery Street or Little Montgomery Street and Howard Street, and your maybe more broadly between Charles and Utah. I mean, this was a really, really consequential African American neighborhood where you had, your hardest working and most well-to-do Black people. And so, Watkins is running a school of 70 or 80 young people. He's teaching history, geography, mathematics, English, natural philosophy, Greek, Latin music, and rhetoric. And he was, thought to have been a grammarian of such precision in the way of etymology, syntax, prosody, and so on that one of his former pupils wrote humorously of the old leather strap Watkins used to correct grammar misuses. And so he was also a bit of a strict disciplinarian. And we can see that with the institution of the church so nearby, you sort of have this like outcropping or like a cluster of really valuable African American institutional possibilities, churches and schools. One of the people who came from the neighborhood, from Montgomery Street, in fact, was William Douglas, who seems to have attended Coker's African School as a student colleague of William Watkins. Douglas was thought to be the most remarkable kind of Black theologian that was produced really after people like Peter Williams and even Absalom, not excluding even Absalom Jones. William Douglas will go on to become the minister of the St. Thomas Episcopalian Church in Philadelphia, the oldest, again, like the second oldest Black church in the United States, or the church that is coming out of the African worship house that started by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. So, in this time, I'm going to mention the Episcopal Church again, but in this time, there's not so much daylight between the Methodist Episcopalians and the African Methodist Episcopalians and the African Protestant Episcopalians. But in any event, Douglas who was also a writer, was sort of an important early figure who comes out from this period. And if you think about these relationships where you have Watkins married to Henrietta Russell, the daughter of Richard Russell, one of the founders of the Sharp Street Church, and then the children from that household, the oldest, William J. Watkins Jr. says, may we prove ourselves worthy of such a father. I mean, they did absolutely understand what was taking place in their household relative to, again, those three areas, religion, education, and abolition. And William J. will go on to work for Frederick Douglass with the North Star. But maybe it's in his most important role, William Watkins, who signed his journalism, the colored Baltimorean, to protect himself because he lived in the South below the Mason-Dixon line. But William Watkins is really the region's most foremost abolitionist, and he's publishing in Freedom's Journal. He's publishing in The Liberator. He's publishing in Lundy's The Genius of Universal Emancipation. And he was like a firebrand and someone who was incredibly critical of not only slaveholding and slave trading and I suppose, the great contradiction of the American Constitution, but he was also very, very impatient with people who had relationships with slaveholders or who compromised in any way with slavery. So when the colonization movement really starts to pick up steam, like in the later 1820s and 1830s, he condemned everything that was going on. And there are many prominent white and Black Baltimoreans who were involved with this movement, basically where they wanted free people to return to return. They wanted free people to go to West Africa. And famously, William Watkins, who is one of the key figures around the idea of America for Black Americans. Just he wrote that this is a contradiction. If you're saying we're unqualified to live here, why would you send us someplace else, to be a nuisance and of all classes of the population vicious? And why would we be able to civilize Africa if that's what you really believe about us? So he's really, really quite gifted in exposing the hypocrisy of the era, even sometimes among benefactors. So what's interesting is that so I think we can safely presume that Frances Ellen Watkins gets a really, really solid foundation as a young person. All of the African American run schools in Baltimore, to my knowledge, were co-educational. Even the Oblate Sisters of Providence, who will begin as offering education to young women, will eventually have co-educational models. But there was something that's going on, and some scholars think that this is connected to just sort of straightforward gender politics that William Watkins didn't think that Frances needed, much education. She sort of begins to serve, I don't know if it was an apprenticeship or if she's just sent out to service in the home of Robert and Ansa Armstrong, apparently around 1838, 1839. And something that's quite interesting, as you sort of look into these figures, is that the Armstrongs, Robert Armstrong was a bookseller. And around that time, they're starting to get some of these writings that are wanting to, sort of make a foray into the question of slavery and manumission. And there was a book, An Inquiry into the Condition and Prospects of the African Race, that was sort of on their shelves. And sort of one wonders about Frances Ellen Watkins' exposure to these kinds of materials, especially as they looked at sort of local situation. In all the cities of the South, there's a class of free blacks who've risen above the obstacles that surround them, and by perseverance and well-doing have established a character for honesty and industry and are in prosperous circumstances. Because there's something that's supposed to have come up where she wrote an article that attracted the attention of the lady in whose family she was employed. And so she may have had some either opportunities, duties, obligations, we don't really know, as a result of this connection that took place when she was a young teenager. One of the things that she did do, she's serving she's providing childcare, she's providing servant work in the household. She's also working as a seamstress. And I think it's fascinating, the circulation of these kinds of embroidered tapestries during her era. Even the ordained minister, the ordained reverend of the Black Episcopal Church, William Levington, is creating these tapestries in the 1830s. And there's an exhibit at the Maryland Center for History and Culture, that sort of offers the opportunity to take a look at some of the embroidery work that continues to be done, but also to see the example of some other African American children who are creating these kinds of things in the 1830s and 1840s. Presumably, it was really something that had a certain kind of consequence and value to Black communities. And certainly, this is a part of Frances Ellen Watkins' experience. Somehow, sort of like among her many duties and the foundations that she did have, though, she got to the point where her writing really, really took off. And it's difficult to imagine, sort of how we get to the point where around 1848, 1849, she is taking a manuscript to the local bookseller. The bookseller's name is Young, and publishing really what I think we would consider like the second, perhaps the third book of poetry by an African American woman in the United States. And we have the great fortune with the scholarship of Johanna Ortner, and to be able to lay our eyes on a work that sort of had been considered lost for several generations. But here in Maryland, we sort of have this book, Forest Leaves. Just, sort of quickly read through, this poem, Ethiopia. The book is not like an abolitionist tract by any means. I mean, perhaps we would understand that because, I mean, it's being published in Baltimore, where, you can cause a riot, or you could potentially be killed, or, sold into slavery, for having the temerity, to make those kinds of arguments in a particular kind of a bold public way. But we do have poems that are very, very interested in analogs and allegory, and also promoting African identity, like Ethiopia, analogs and allegories to the political situation. Um, yes, Ethiopia shall stretch her bleeding hands abroad, her cry of agony shall reach the burning throne of God. The tyrant's yoke from off her neck, his fetters from her soul, the mighty hand of God shall break and spurn their vile control. Redeemed from dust and freed from chains, her sons shall lift their eyes. From cloud-capped hills and verdant plains shall shouts of triumph rise. Upon her dark, despairing brow shall play a smile of peace. For God hath bent unto her woe and bade her sorrows cease. Neath sheltering vines and stately palms shall laughing children play, and aged sires with joyous psalms shall gladden every day. Secure by night and blessed by day shall pass her happy hours, nor human tigers hunt for prey within her peaceful bowers. Then Ethiopia, stretch, oh stretch, thy bleeding hands abroad, thy cry of agony shall reach and find redress from God. So, she's, quite moving and powerful. And sometimes that's the way she was described, in the subsequent decades as a lecturer on the anti-slavery circuit. She does have, again, one poem that, is a little, okay, working with, sort of kind of allegorical about the Bible defense of slavery, but it doesn't, it's not sort of weighing directly into the issue, but it's giving us a taste and tenor of the political views of the writer. And of course, as you might imagine, right, it's really announcing that she's a Black woman. And the last thing that I'll mention is that the artifact that we have, I mean, that's at the Center for History and Culture, was actually owned apparently by, if you can sort of see the name H. Webb. And so that's actually Harrison Holmes Webb, who was the second African American minister of the St. James Church. And the Fugitive Slave Act, the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, is going to sort of cause the Watkins family to move from Baltimore. I mean, the only home that they'd ever known. But William J. Watkins is going to move to Toronto. He's going to take his family there. Some of them will relocate in other places in the North. And Frances does not go with them. But she does leave Baltimore, going to Ohio, where she teaches embroidery and sewing at the Union Seminary, an African Methodist Episcopal school. But I do find it interesting that, the one person, I mean, we have one extant copy of this volume, the one person that we know who bought the book or who supported her writing was Harrison Holmes Webb. He was a lay reader, at St. James and was ordained by 1854. I mean, again, an incredibly rare event in the history of the church, but also suggestive of the strong ties among at least a certain class of African Americans in Baltimore. Sorry that we don't have a chance for questions, but we should have many opportunities over the rest of the year where we're celebrating the life of Frances Harper to have more discussions. Thank you very much, and I will be with you soon.
Always learn a ton when I hear from Dr. Jackson, and
Yes.
really appreciate that overview that he's provided. So what we're going to do next is, while we still encourage folks to drop their questions in the Q&A and help support our conversation, we're going to hear next from Betty Bland Thomas, more about the Sharp-Leadenhall community, some of those connections to Mrs. Harper. And I do just want to say really quickly to give a shout out to the Maryland Women's Heritage Center also for their role in lifting up this story and collaborating with us at MCHC. So we wouldn't have been able to put this forward without their efforts as well. Miss Betty, do you want to get us started and talk a bit more about some of those community connections?
For sure. I have some slides for our guests. I do need to make a correction. I am the president of the Historic Sharp-Leadenhall Community, and have been the past president of the Sharp-Leadenhall Planning Committee, Inc., which became inactive in 2011. And we did form the Historic Sharp-Leadenhall Community Association in 2011. So our function has really been, honoring and preserving our history. As an urban community, we unfortunately have been a product of displacement, disinvestment. But one of the things we're definitely proud of and want to continue to cultivate as we learn more about our rich history. We've learned it here, and Dr. Jackson definitely commented on that, but in the South Baltimore area, it had the largest population of free Afro-Americans. It was also a very diverse community where they had the Irish, Haitians, French, and other Europeans who lived also in that area. So it's also been the think tank for the Black community, very rich with its churches. It's mentioned at the Sharp Street Church, which was once at the corner of Sharp and Lombard Street, was very active in offering education, worship, and a meeting place, because we're talking about a period of time where slave was the law. So people moving about had to be careful. But I think, as Dr. Jackson commented, because of the large population of free Afro-Americans, there was also this working together sort of community. We had persons, Afro-Americans as well as whites, that were educated and communicated and worked together and supported the abolition movement. So the community of Historic Sharp-Leadenhall wants to work very hard in documenting more of its rich history. And 2 years ago, we came across a photo and a sketch of Miss Watkins on the corner of Sharp Street near the old Audubon Church. And just being a layperson of history, just did a little research, and I said, oh my God, this woman's history is fantastic. She's done so much in her writings and how she was educated by her uncle, excuse me, and was able to participate alongside persons like Frederick Douglass and participate in the underground movement at a time when women weren't taking on such active roles. Yes, they were fighting for their rights, but Black women weren't at the forefront of these rights, except Frances Watkins was. So not only was she an educated, a passionate woman, she was a mother and had been a wife as well. And she tried to her best ability to free her people. Our community in its preservation efforts has fortunate to get a grant through the South Baltimore Gateway Partnership, and we put up vertical banners, 55 of those banners, and we've recognized 10 each of Frances Watkins, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Elijah Cummings, because all four of these persons have history, in our community. If we could go to the next slide, I'd like to show what that banner looks like if Ms. Green is still able to, okay. So, which would be to my left, you see, we have two banners with Frances Ellen Watkins' name on it, and we note her history. She was a poet, a novelist, a public speaker, a suffragist, abolitionist, and a freedom fighter. And she was the most noted writer of the 19th century of Afro-American descent. So throughout our community, we have these banners along with the other persons I've mentioned, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, also Elijah Cummings, because our community, due to gentrification, has been encroached by other surrounding communities. And we wanted people to know that they're in a historic Black community. So these banners are a rededication to our space, even though we've shrunk down to the point that we have. Also in March, we did a lecture, and we were at the historic Ebenezer AME Church. And these were some of the guests who were able to stay towards the end of the lecture. And we also had a noted speaker, Dr. Cheryl LaRoche, who also did an extensive job and enlighten us on the rich history of Ms. Watkins Harper. Here myself, and also a staff person from the Neighborhood Design Center, which was very helpful in helping the community, because this was a community-led project. And one of the things our community is most proud of, that even though we don't have the background as historians, we are working towards doing what we can to have our space recognized. And working with the folks here in this panel has been very helpful. It was through my contact with Dr. Ivan March that encouraged me to continue to speak about our history. And I had the opportunity in being in Hopkins and to talk about our community's history and some of the efforts that we're making. We've done lectures, we've done walking tours, which we will continue to do. And here, back in March of this year, we did a lecture on Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Dr. LaRoche was our speaker. And we had, as I mentioned, a really good turnout of folks, but still not everybody knows about her, and we want to work, towards that. Could I see the next slide, please? Okay, there should have been one before that. But what I want to say, I guess, in closing, thank you. A little bit about our community. Over time, we have made some great accomplishments, but it has been a struggle. It's like if you take one step, development will make you take several steps backwards. So it's noted here from the 1700s to the 1800s. As it's noted, in 1789, Baltimore Abolition Society was founded, and it was the first of its kind in the South. Remember, Maryland is a Southern state. Maryland had laws that enslaved Black people. And as Dr. Jackson mentioned, they'd even passed a law, if you were free and came back to Baltimore or back into Maryland, you could be captured and put back into bondage. And so that did happen. Also in 1797, the society opened up the first Afro Academy in Baltimore, which was the first purpose-built Afro-American school in the United States. By 1857, I'm sorry, that that number is incorrect. We had in Baltimore, in the South Baltimore area, close to, my data says, over 3,000 free Afro-Americans that were also living in that space. And so it created what I believe a think tank where Blacks could continue their crafts, continue to support their families, continue their education, continue to fight for freedom, and be a hub for the Underground Railroad. I think a history in which our city, Baltimore City, our state, Maryland, should be very proud of that a small group was instrumental in working against what Maryland laws was enforcing, which was slavery. In the 1900s and early 1900s, unfortunately for us, the city was looking at some zoning. And by 1831, many of our residents were pushed out. Then after World War II, there was this highway to nowhere, which also displaced a large number of our residents, and particularly, the homeowners. But many activists did collaborate and fought against this. And we were able to stop the mass destruction. But unfortunately, we did lose some of our community space, as a result of that. I'm checking on my time because I know we do want to allow for questioning and answering. But real quickly, in 2000, we were able to get local historic designation. We want to broaden that designation. We're facing gentrification, continued disinvestment, and some real zoning battles, we're fighting about. But our community still continues to try to stay active. We do festivals, we have beautification efforts. We are focusing on our seniors' well-being, our youth, and continuing historic preservation. The map shows where we once were and how we shrunk to the space that we're in now. If you look at our website, we have much more of an overview of the impact that has occurred in Historic Sharp-Leadenhall. But Frances Watkins is one of our stars, and we will continue to work along with Ms. Ida, Dr. Jackson, and other institutions to continue to spread the good news about her work and get some federal recognition, as well. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to be with these persons who are much more seasoned in the area of preservation and history. Thank you.
Wonderful context for us to think about, especially as we think about how we continue to recognize these individuals, banners, names on buildings. These things are significant. They're not just symbols, right? They allow us to carry on that legacy. So if I could ask Dr. Jones as well to join us. I'm not seeing many questions in the Q&A, but as always, I come with my own questions, and Dr. Jones has given us some things to think about in the chat, as well as some of our visitors. So Dr. Jones, could you tell us a bit more about some of the organizations that Mrs. Harper was involved with, and how that also intersects with some of these national as well as local movements?
Yes, thank you for that. I'm so excited that Betty was able to get some time, and I want her to get more time because I think it's practical that we think about the modern space. But yes, so she belonged to a number of clubs. She was a founding member of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which still persists today. And they were founded in 1896. And this organization of African-American women sought to do the kinds of social work and social justice work on behalf of those women who didn't have the luxury with which to do so. So whether it was about nursing or baby care or home needs, they really rolled up their sleeves and made things happen. She served as the first vice president under people like Mary Church Terrell, who was a renowned figure in and of herself, and then Ida B. Wells as well. So she really was kind of the middle of the extremes, the extremely rich and educated, as well as those who are far more agrarian and grassroots. I'm a member of the ACWC, and they still celebrate her greatly in that organization. And I also want to just mention about suffrage. We think about suffrage and we think about the 19th Amendment. We think of this as a great moment of women's unity. There was a great deal of fracture along racial lines, class lines, and ethnic lines in the suffrage movement. And Harper really kind of gets rooted out, I suppose, in terms of her speaking rather candidly in 1867 on the verge of the 50th Amendment. There was discussion to enfranchise all unfranchised people, which means the 99% would have gotten the vote. But I guess the legislators thought, well, that's almost too generous. Let's just give it to, quote, men. And they always wanted to paint the men's faces as black, but it was all men who did not own property, did not have a voice in the franchise. And that caused a great rift in the women's movement because people like Susan B. Anthony and others who had been laboring for nearly half of the 19th century felt betrayed. And they used a lot of what we would now call racist language to talk about ethnic immigrants, both white and persons of color, in derogatory ways. So Harper gives a poem, all bound up together. And she says, white women are not just dewdrops exhaled from the skies. They are in three categories: the good, the bad, and the ugly. And that there are those who would do good on behalf of everybody, those who would do ugly on behalf of themselves, and those in the middle who would just go with the strongest wind blowing. It's then that she's kind of written out of the annals of history, and she's kind of replaced with Harriet Tubman. Harper did not have a sob story like Tubman, and that's not to belittle or demean the life that Harriet Tubman left, but she was once again in the middle. And she was very true to form and loved words and used them in a very strategic way. So when the women's movement split into the NASA, the National Association of Women's Suffrage, and then the AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, they were not just polarized along racial lines, they were also polarized along ideological lines. One group said we need to get a federal law for the vote. And another group said, no, just go state by state. So Frances joined the AWSA, which will eventually morph into what is now called the League of Women Voters. So for those in the audience who belong to the League of Women Voters, that is a relic of the suffrage movement of which Frances was a part of that still persists today. So I think we can find her in soft spaces in a very poetic way, making a change for the betterment of humanity. Long answer. Thank you.
We historians and educators love long answers, so no worries there. I do want to acknowledge Linda's comment in the chat as well that Harper is a figure that figures prominently in Martha Jones's vanguard. And I think, just the sheer amount of scholars that are looking at this individual also gives you a sense of, how significant she could or should be, and also how unrecognized she may have been in the past to the point that this effort is so necessary. So Dr. Martha Jones, another individual who works at Johns Hopkins, supporting lifting up these stories. So we want to thank her for that contribution as well. So I know we are coming up on time, but I do also see that Rebecca Hackett has joined us in the Q&A to ask, would like to know more of the tie between Harrison Holmes Webb and Frances Ellen Watkins. I would like to know that as well. And I think that's something that, Rebecca, we need to follow up with Dr. Jackson, unless either of you have any insight about that question.
I have a little insight. I do Methodist church history, and the conflation between Methodism, not AMEs, but the Methodist, United Methodism, and the Episcopalian Church for African Americans during that first quarter of the 19th century were extremely intricate. You have the Absalom Jones, Richard Allen situation in Philadelphia. So they were growing as basically twins in this white denomination that endorsed certain behaviors that were a law, like chattel slavery. But then you found these Black people who chose to remain. And it's going to be my belief that they're going to remain in those denominations to make those denominations have a kind of come to Jesus moment, no pun intended, that they need to live out the actual dictates of the Bible, not the law of the land. So you're going to find the Methodists and the Episcopals, or Black Episcopalians and United Methodists or Methodist Episcopals in that early first quarter, extremely in conversation, extremely educated and literate, and really seeking to bring about the change within those denominations to move the needle for the nation. And that's what I think Dr. Jackson was going towards in that regard. And I know Ms. Hackett does a great deal of work with St. James history, so I know I won't step there, but I'll just stay on the Methodist side of this conversation.
Yeah, we want to thank Ms. Hackett for her collaboration as well, and learning more about St. James history and supporting the development of that exhibition at MCHC, which is still open, as well as utilizing some of those research materials that Dr. Jackson was featuring in his slides. We do have one more question, and I think we'll have to wrap up here. But what do you think was Frances' greatest contribution to literature, to the emancipation movement, and to the suffrage movement? This seems primed for a nice long answer, but we'll try to summarize that as best as we can. So, Dr. Jones or Ms. Betty, do you have any insight on that?
I'd leave it to Dr. Jones. I'm sure she has more information than I have. I feel what she did in dedicating her life to justice, dedicating her life to women's suffrage, for better rights for women. And her own life experience did not hinder her from keep fighting, losing her husband, losing a child, the disappointment she had from clubs that she participated in hopes to change ideas and thinking. It's almost unfortunate she was born too soon. But I do believe she set a precedent. She let us know that even during that time, women fought hard, and we need more recognition for the commitment women. They gave their entire life for justice, and surely should be recognized for that. Yeah.
That is a fitting conclusion. But in terms of her literature, I think we will be able to see Forest Leaves in person in September. But her poem, Bury Me in a Free Land, is much like a movie, because she's talking about seeing enslaved Africans in the coffles or in the chains being paraded. And Dr. Jackson gave a very nice proxemics for you to see where she's living and where this trade is actually happening. I don't think we can relate to that. I guess it would be equivalent to maybe a dog shelter or an animal shelter, that you see these things, but to know that human beings were being traded and sold like furniture or livestock. I can't imagine what that meant to her, because you're reading this book that says God is the father of all men and we're all brothers and sisters. And how are you doing this to another sister or brother? So her poem, Bury Me in a Free Land, is probably the most salient literature piece, because it really gives you a word picture. Make me a grave wherever you will, in a lofty plain or a lowly hill. Make it among earth's humblest graves, but bury me not in a land of slaves. I could not rest if around my grave I heard the steps of a trembling slave. Their shadow rise above my tomb, would make it a place of fearful gloom. That's as far as I remembered. But it's very prominent because it's not just the iambic pentameter of it, but it gives you an actual picture. You can actually see that happening in live time. And that's what she lived around. And so I think it impels her to be voice for those voiceless and agency for those who are agency-less. And so.
Yes. Well said. Thank you.
We can leave it at that. And, again, Chloe is joining us, but I want to thank our presenters and panelists again for their amazing contributions and the many collaborators that will continue to make this happen throughout this year. So thank you all for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, all of our wonderful attendees as well. Betty, Ida, David, I hope you got to see all the love and praise that's rolling in the chat. Also, Ida, I'm so in awe that you remembered as much of that poem as you did and just read it. I wish I could. I went to art school and I can't do that. So but thank you all. Thank you all for joining. Please make sure to look out for the recorded, edited version of this program that will be posted on our virtual program archive in the coming weeks. And as Ida kind of put a little sneak peek in there, please join us later this fall. In September, we'll be celebrating Frances' actual birthday here at MCHC on Thursday, September 25th. Yes, I believe. Sorry, I have a lot of dates in my head today, but we're going to have all kinds of goodies, treats, poetry readings. So it'll be a wonderful time and a chance to come and see the Forest Leaves live and in person. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for your time and for your expertise. We hope everybody has a beautiful, wonderful, air-conditioned evening. And we look forward to seeing you all at our next program. And please keep in
Sure.
touch with us here at MCHC if we can ever help with anything else. That's for our panelists and our attendees. So
Okay.
thank you all.
All righty. Bye.